Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook again, and we're wrapping up our lectures on the latter Middle Ages from week 5. So this is our third episode from week 5. Today we're going to talk about the reform movements and heresies of the latter Middle Ages. So let's jump right in. This is a picture of John Wycliffe reading from his Bible. He was an English translator of the Bible in the 14th century and one of the early Proto-Reformers. Just a second. There we go. So during this period, there was a number of heretical groups like the Cathars, as well as Proto-Reform groups such as the Waldensians, the Hussites of John Huss, and the Wycliffites of John Wycliffe fame. And so we'll talk about these one at a time. Although the Council of Constance had been preoccupied with issues concerning papal succession, we just finished in the last episode talking about the Great Western Schism and the Avignon Papacy, a real low point for the Roman Catholic Church. Other matters that emerged as important, such as the threat of heresy. The Bohemian reformer Jan Hus, who lived in basically in the end of the 14th and early 15th centuries, was gaining a significant following for his program of reform within the church. Significantly, Huss's demands were given added importance by the growing tide of nationalism in the region. Heresy began to emerge as a significant problem for the Church in Western Europe in the 11th century, having had a low profile in the previous 3 centuries. Some suggest that the year 1000 was seen as possessing mystical significance, triggering a wave of heretical speculation during the millennial generation, which would be from 1000 to 1033. The study of heresy in Western Europe during the Middle Ages raises some important questions of definition. Some of the movements that were declared to be heretical by the Roman Catholic Church actually seem to represent renewal or modification of the older heresies, or reform. One person's heresy is another person's reformer. The Cathars are an excellent example of this. They were a religious sect that appeared in the Languedoc region of France in the 11th century. They flourished in southern France during the following 2 centuries. This sect adopted views that are recognizably Gnostic, the ever-perennial heresy of Gnosticism, always lurking around. Perhaps they originated from Eastern Europe, such as the notion that matter was intrinsically evil, and that the dialectic between inferior creating divinity and a superior redeeming divinity, that is, the tension or the struggle between the creator, an inferior creator, and a superior redeemer. Others, however, seem to fall into a more political category, movements which posed a threat to the temporal authority of the church. This challenge might take the form of an alternative vision of society, or of the privileged place of the church in the interpretation of Scripture. An example of such a movement are the Waldensians, a reform movement which emerged in southern France around the year 1170 and resulted in the activity of a wealthy Lyonnais merchant by the name of Valdez. Valdez embarked on a reforming ministry which was based on a literal reading of the Bible, particularly its injunctions to poverty, and a biblically based preaching in the vernacular. This ethos contrasted sharply with the somewhat loose morality of the clergy at that time and attracted considerable support in southern France and Lombardy. Although this was little more than a grassroots movement seeking reform, it was regarded as a significant threat to power and status of the church. Another group was pioneered by Wycliffe. The politicization of the notion of heresy is best seen in the church's reaction to John Wycliffe, born in 1320. He was an English theologian who is often credited with inspiring the first translation in English of the Bible. Wycliffe argued extensively, both in English and Latin, for the translation of the Bible into his native English. He used the Latin Vulgate text of the Bible. He didn't have access to the original Hebrew or Greek texts. For Wycliffe, the English people had a right to read the Bible in their own language, rather than to be forced to listen to what their clergy wished them to hear. As Wycliffe pointed out, the ecclesiastical establishment had considerable vested interests in not allowing laity access to the Bible. And a few years later, we'll hear the same argument from Martin Luther about the German people and a translation in German. Another group were the Brethren of the Common Life. Monasteries and convents played a critical role in maintaining Christian ideals in the Middle Ages. Yet this concentration of theological and spiritual excellence within the monastic tradition had some unintended consequences. For example, the everyday life of the laity was often virtually untouched by spiritual riches that were being developed behind monastic walls. Monastic spirituality often presupposed a lifestyle and outlook that was alien to the everyday lay people. Many reforming movements in the later Middle Ages sought to bridge the gap between the religious orders and the lay people. Both Dominicans and Franciscans represented serious attempts to reconnect the Christian faith with wider culture. One of the most important of these developments took place in the 14th century in the Low Countries. Groups known by the Latin phrase Devotio Moderna, or modern devotion, and the Brethren of the Common Life. The modern devotion had its origins in the flourishing commercial towns of the Low Countries, and of course by that it's speaking of Holland, the Netherlands. Gerard Groot, born in 1340, was the son of a prominent merchant whose family had risen to become leading cloth merchants and were wealthy as a result. In 1374, while seriously ill, Groot had a conversion experience which caused him to abandon his comfortable lifestyle and adopt an ascetic way of living. That reminds us a little bit of St. Francis. So in Groot's legacy from his legacy emerged two different types of communities. The first was the movement known as the Brethren of the Common Life. The Brethren devoted themselves to religious exercises, the quest for personal renewal by reflecting on the person of Christ, manual work, and service to others. Many scholars have described the Brethren as practical mystics. They developed an emphasis on education through the founding of schools, colleges, and becoming teachers at existing institutions. One of the most influential spiritual works of the late Middle Ages had its origins with the Devotio Moderna. And this was was authored by Thomas à Kempis, who came into contact with the movement while studying at Deventer, and is thought to have written the spiritual classic, The Imitation of Christ, at some point during the period 418 through 27. The work is enormously influential and was copied extensively in the 15th century. The invention of printing increased its influence even further. and is now what is widely cited as one of the most influential works of Christian spirituality of all time. I was at a book retreat, a reading retreat recently, and one of my friends had brought a copy of The Imitation of Christ and was reading it for the first time and gave a report on it. So Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ is characterized by its emphasis on the interior life and withdrawal from the world, which marks it off from other works which encourage an active imitation of the example of Christ. There's a criticism of speculation and an affirmation of the importance of the love of God. What good does it do if you dispute loftily about the Trinity, but lack humility and therefore displease the Trinity? Is it not lofty words that make you righteous or holy or dear to God, but a virtuous life? I would much rather experience contrition than be able to give a definition of it. This is a quote from Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ. This brings us to the topic of popular religion, or the cult of saints. This is particularly important for my area of specialization in Latin American religion, because popular religion or folk religion has been very strong in the tradition of Latin American Catholicism, particularly in Mexico, in Brazil, Peru. There's a strong thread of folk religion or popular religion practiced by the everyday people who consider themselves Catholic. To make sense of how Christianity developed during the Middle Ages, it is important to appreciate how it impacted different groups of people. So, how did Christianity relate to the everyday world outside the universities, outside of monasteries and royal courts? In recent years, scholarship has given increased attention to the phenomenon of popular religion or folk religion, in which Christian ideas and practices were adapted and implemented in rural life. So this phenomenon of folk religion often bore a tangential relationship to the more precise yet abstract statements of Christian doctrine that the church preferred but that many lay people found unintelligible. In parts of Europe, something close to fertility cults emerged, connected and enmeshed with patterns and concerns of everyday life. You might consider that like a reemergence of paganism with a Christian facade. The agrarian needs of rural communities, such as haymaking and harvesting, were firmly associated with popular religion. For example, in the early 16th century, the saints were regularly invoked in order to ward off animal and infant diseases, the plague, and eye trouble, or to ensure that young women could find appropriate husbands. The direct connection of religion and everyday life was taken for granted. The spiritual and the material were interconnected at every level. The medieval Catholic Church was encountered by ordinary people through its practices and images rather than its abstract theological ideas. The recognition of the importance of the saints dated back to early Christianity, where vigils were often held at the tombs of prominent Christian leaders, especially those who had been martyred for their faith. I might also recall that in our first chapter of this book, it mentions that within Roman paganism or Roman classic religion, there was a cult a cult of the dead, or a cult of those who had died before, the virtuous, that may have influenced, you might see the seed of that in this cult of the saints. Gradually, a cult of veneration of the saints developed with three distinct elements. The first being commemoration. Here, a specific day would be set aside in the church's calendar to recall the life and teachings of a saint. Some saints were recognized as having universal significance. Others were seen as being of local importance. Also, there's the cult of relics. Relics, in Latin, there are things that are left behind, were material objects associated with the saints, which were seen as pledges or tokens of the saint's intercessory power. Such relics included body parts as well as objects which have belonged to the saint or been used by the saint. Also, pilgrimage. Pilgrimages to shrines were associated with the saints. In the Middle Ages, there were many such sacred sites, such as the Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, linked to the Apostle James, or the tomb of the martyred Archbishop Thomas of Becket at Canterbury. The cult of the saints played a major role in the medieval Christianity, especially at the popular level. One way of understanding this is to consider the idea of a heavenly court. God was compared to a monarch, surrounded by the glittering company of courtiers, namely the saints. One of the key themes of the cult of the saints is the notion of the saint's intercessory power, his or her ability to gain a hearing at the court of heaven. The idea of saints as advocates was popular in the Middle Ages, and that has continued throughout the modern period here in Latin America.